My project was on the representation of African and Asian Americans in film and television. So before we get into my research, I want you to think back to the last movie or TV show episode that you watched. Think about the main characters, their friends, their family members. Think about the actors who played them. Then answer the following questions. 1. Were any of the characters people of color? 2. If yes, what role did they play in the film or television episode? 3. If yes, did their behavior exemplify damaging stereotypes? I too practiced this same exercise while making this presentation. The last movie I watched was one of those silly Christmas romances, and exactly 0 of the characters were African American or Asian American. They were all white. To really dig into the reasoning behind the lack of positive representation of these race and ethnic groups, I asked 4 guiding questions for my project. These questions were used to fuel my research, which consisted of research studies, new information posted in online journals, and interviews with friends from these racial and ethnic groups. I decided to focus on why is representation of these marginalized groups important? How has their representation on screen been both historically and currently? How diverse are the people behind the camera, such as writers and directors? And what can we do to create a more inclusive and diverse television and film industry? To begin, positive and real-to-life representation is important because television and film have been predominantly white since its inception. As Peggy McIntosh pointed out in her article entitled The Invisible Knapsack, white people can turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of their race widely represented. It is a part of white privilege that there has been varied and complex representation of white individuals on screen. Think about how it must feel to not see people like yourself in these forms of media that we often consume. Furthermore, researcher Yuki Fujioka has done several studies on how television viewing affects the opinions of both majority and minority groups. In one 1999 study, Fujioka discusses cultivation theory, which says, since so many Americans ingest film and television on a daily basis, the pictures on the screen have an effect on their perceptions of people who are different from themselves. To piggyback on that, there is such a thing as the negativity effect, which means that negative information receives more weight in observers' formation of impressions. Especially in the US, where race relations are more volatile, negative images on the screen seem to reinforce preconceived negative opinions. Not only do we need positive representation for people in the macro culture, we need positive representation for the people in these marginalized groups. The social identity theory states that people process information differently when it is self-referencing. In another Fujioka study, Mexican Americans and white Americans were watching news stories about people from different ethnic groups. They paid the most attention to and remembered the most about the stories about people who looked like them. This shows that all people want representation on the screen, and since it carries such a strong influence, it needs to be done correctly. This brings us to the next question. How have African and Asian Americans historically been portrayed in TV shows and films in America? According to Slate magazine, marginalized groups in television are portrayed often in broad strokes, relegated to uninteresting storylines, trotted out as the token, or portrayed as stereotypes. Take Indian and Indian American portrayals, for example. Oftentimes, when you see an Indian character on screen, they have a stereotypical Indian accent, which is not true for many Indian Americans who have lived in the United States for their whole lives. You also tend to see Indian American actors in jobs that have become stereotypical of Indians, such as cab drivers, IT consultants, or convenience store owners. Finally, they sometimes hold the place of the exotic or weird foreigner, who has difficulty understanding customs of those around them. Think Raj on The Big Bang Theory, who is often the butt of racist comments from other characters on the show. Also think Apu from The Simpsons. He's a convenience store owner voiced by a white actor who does what some would call a racist accent for the character. And here's an Indian character from an Indiana Jones movie eating monkey brains, a fabricated custom to emphasize the otherness of this culture. Another minority group that has been historically portrayed in broad strokes with unimaginative tropes is that of African Americans. In TV and film, African Americans are sometimes portrayed as living in the urban core, surrounded by violence, drugs, and crime. Other times, they're portrayed as successful middle-class families who have committed themselves to hard work. However, some studies, like that of Fujioka, argue that in those circumstances, the families are usually portrayed as integrated into white communities, and the values portrayed are those of white communities rather than the African Americans themselves. Another stereotypical role for an African American is that of the token best friend. In this trope, African Americans are often relegated to the support system for the white protagonist so that we don't learn anything substantial about their own personal lives. Think Winston from the comedy New Girl, who we don't learn anything about for several seasons, or even Sam from Casablanca, who's relegated to Humphrey Bogart's best friend. This brings us to today's statistics regarding diversity in films and television. According to a study of 100 popular films from 2014 by USC Annenberg, 73.1% of all characters in the films were white. 17 films had no African American speaking characters, and over 40 films had no Asian speaking characters, and only 17 films had a lead by an actor from an underrepresented race or ethnicity. These percentages have barely changed from 2007. In 2007, 13% of characters in films were African American and 3.4% were Asian. 7 years later, 12.5% of characters were Black and 5.3% were Asian, showing very little progress in representation. Another problem with representation in Hollywood today is whitewashing. Whitewashing is a casting practice in the United States in which white actors are cast in non-white character roles. Even when characters with diverse backgrounds are written into a script, they are not always played by people from those ethnic or racial groups. Here are just a few examples. Max Minghella, a British actor of Chinese and European descent, played the Indian-American Divya Narendra in the Social Network movie in 2010. Mickey Rooney famously or infamously played a stereotypical Japanese character in 1961's Breakfast at Tiffany's. And in 2015, the movie Aloha, directed by Cameron Crowe, starred Emma Stone as a character who was written as a quarter Chinese and a quarter Hawaiian. Obviously, there are many problems with the representation of minorities in the mediums of television and film, both historically and currently. But why is this the case? Some will say that it is a direct correlation to the representation of these minorities behind the camera. As Fujioka notes, one of the main concerns about minority portrayals, including that of African Americans, is that these images are developed and controlled by dominant white decision makers. In other words, the majority of people writing, directing, and producing television and films in the United States are white, and when white writers write ethnic minority characters, problematic representation occurs. Let's look at some of the statistics for writers in Hollywood. A new study by a UCLA professor has shown that only 4.8% of TV writers are African American. With over 3,817 writers examined and 234 series, the results are shown in this pie chart. While Black representation on the screen is at about 13%, the percentage of African American writers are well below this number. This could be one reason for the troubling representations and stereotypes that make it into the films and shows. Furthermore, the Writers Guild of America reports that minorities account for 13% of television writers in America. This means that they are represented at a factor of about 3 to 1 among writers in the sector. On a positive note, the Directors Guild of America came out with a report just last month with some encouraging statistics. The employment of women and minority directors set an all-time record in the 2016-2017 television season. The number of ethnic minority directors increased from 19% of shows a year ago to 22% last season. African Americans directed 13% of the shows, Asian Americans directed 5%. While this is certainly encouraging, there is definitely still room for growth. As you can see from this chart, some networks, especially Netflix, are still at a low percentage when it comes to employing both women and minority directors. So the final question remains, what can we do to create a more inclusive and diverse television and film industry? Well, number one, we need to support shows with diverse casts. We have several shows on television right now that are doing a great job of highlighting ethnically diverse groups in a positive light. Master of None on Netflix, Blackish, Fresh Off the Boat, and The Mindy Project, the first sitcom in America to ever star a female Indian American, are all shows that challenge racial stereotypes and portray their characters in realistic and positive lights. Another step in the right direction is analyzing films and shows with a critical eye. In his article, Evolutionary Stages of Minorities in Mass Media, Fitzgerald notes Clarke's four-step model by which to judge minority representations. The first is non-recognition, where they do not even appear to exist in the dominant media. The second is ridicule, which is the stage where damaging stereotypes are prevalent. Then comes regulation, in which certain minority characters are presented as enforcers of the dominant group's norms. And finally is respect, where marginalized people are portrayed no differently than any other group. Obviously, respect is the level we want in media. If a show falls into the non-recognition or ridicule realm, perhaps it does not need our support, or at least needs more public criticism in regards to race representation. Finally, another step is supporting diversity in the writer's room. Maybe the correlation between the uptick in more positive TV representation and the increase in minority directors is no mistake. Directors and writers have a big say on what goes on in a film or a show. While we may not have a say on who's hired, being informed is the first step. So now we come to the big question. How does this affect educators and students? Why is it important? Well, as Fujioka stated, television and film shape our ideas about people who are different from us. This means that students may come to our classrooms with opinions of minority groups partially informed by their portrayal on screens. This is a form of disconscious racism in which students' thinking reflects internalized ideologies that justify the racial status quo. It's the job of the teacher to help them become more critically conscious and inspire them to be advocates for change. But how do we do this? Well, just like you would critically analyze a film or a TV show, we must first critically analyze our curriculum and see if it is organized around the mainstream, or if it's multicultural in nature. Just as we compared representation to Clark's 4 R's on the last screen, we should be analyzing our curriculum against Banks' approaches to the integration of multicultural content in our textbooks on page 193 and 194. Are we merely having a heroes and holiday approach, or are we progressing into a curriculum and social action view? Furthermore, we should be inspiring our students to look at media with a critical eye. In the social action curricular approach, students identify important social problems and issues and study prejudice and discrimination. Taking this approach, have students analyze the books in the classroom library, or have them analyze a popular TV show that everyone is watching. Give them the power to view things critically and share their findings with the class. At the very least, we must make sure that the literature, films, and video clips we show in class have realistic representation of marginalized groups so that we do not inform more disconscious racism in our students. While this is by no means an extensive list of what we can do as educators, it is certainly a start.